You're listening to The Nature of Story. I'm Michael Neelsen. Thank you so much for tuning into another episode, another discussion about storytelling in society. This week we have Dan Yashinsky, who is a oral storyteller, as well as the author for the book Suddenly They Heard Footsteps, Storytelling for the 21st Century. He resides out of Toronto, Ontario. I wanted to have him on because he's an oral storyteller by trade. He's found a way, as he'll joke, to make a modest living, but a living nonetheless, telling stories orally. That's the most ancient form of storytelling that we can have, obviously. So, and that we do have. So, but he wrote this fantastic book that's described on the back as a manifesto for storytelling's future and a handbook of stories and inspiration. It's gotten a lot of praise in the Toronto Star, the Edmonton Journal, Quill and Choir. He also edited a book, Tales for an Unknown City, which won the Toronto Book Award. So he's all about this storytelling thing, that's for sure. I'll tell you this. The whole conversation I loved today. I love this discussion that I had with Dan. He's a fascinating guy. He reminds me of a lot of those conversations that I had with artists, actors, writers, and when I lived in Austin, Texas for 4 years, where we would just hang out at a diner until 4 a.m. in the morning and just talk about the big ideas, like what does writing for it's actor-proof writing mean, and what's the role of the director and the power struggle on set, and what can you learn from Machiavelli in that regard, and all these big sprawling ideas. And this was definitely one of those conversations. So if you like that kind of stuff, you're in for a treat. I will point out that we do get a little political in this one at one point, but I enjoyed it nonetheless. His perspective was fascinating as far as the role storytelling has in our elections, in the post-2016 election landscape. But then he also, in the second half of this episode is where we really dig our teeth in and it gets really juicy. So if you find yourself not sure after the first half, I really would stick around for the second half, or skip ahead to the second half, because it gets really, really cool at that point where we start asking big questions that neither of us really know how to answer about the responsibility of the storyteller and what kind of power we wield, and when do you know that you're standing on the precipice of using story in an irresponsible manner and things of this nature. So it's fascinating stuff. So definitely stick around till then. But in the meantime, I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping, in the sense that if you're watching this on YouTube, you notice something different right now, that you don't see me. This is only audio. That's because I'm making a switch here a little bit. I don't know whether I'm going to stop doing the video part entirely or not. I'm just noticing that the two mediums of video and audio, obviously they're very different. I was trying to kind of do both simultaneously, and I'm wondering if I'm doing neither as best as I can as a result. So tell me, any of you who are watching this on YouTube, what do you like about watching on YouTube? If you're listening to this in podcast form, do you prefer that? I think it's very possible that I will turn this into just a strict podcast at some point for the next season, and the YouTube version will just be a waveform video or something. I don't know. There's a couple points in this episode where you'll notice where Dan references that he's showing me something, because we can see each other, and if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see what he's showing me. For the record, what he's showing me is his bookshelf. Because we can see each other, the interview flows with the information that he and I know that we can see from each other. So if you're only listening, you'll miss out on some. So I'm just giving that some thought. So, but today is the first day where I'm just going to be doing an audio intro, no video intro. So, but yeah. Other than that, I think you're going to love this conversation today. It's fantastic. Big ideas. Yeah, without further ado, I give you Dan Yashinsky.
Dan, I want to start kind of broadly with the concept of story in general and what we mean when we say story, or what you mean specifically when you say story, because I feel in order to have any sort of discussion about storytelling from any perspective, everyone's coming at it from a different angle. So when you're talking stories, what are you talking about?
Um, I got interested in the idea of oral storytelling, the word of mouth. So I don't talk that much, at least I don't think that much about stories as a literary form unto itself. I'm really interested in what happens with stories when you say them out loud, which also means you have to remember them, which also means you have to have someone to tell them to. So there's a whole culture around the fact that these are words of mouth. In traditional cultures around the world, they understand that, because I mean a story would be sustained orally. They didn't have recourse to the written word, so they didn't have they couldn't say, oh, you can find it in the archives, or you can double click on it, from the database. It's everything was oral. So I when I got started, and still now, my interest is really storytelling as an oral art form. And I kind of noticed that the word storytelling is used everywhere these days, from how to brand your company and make more profit from your oppressed workers to just about anything else. Everyone's a storyteller now, which means really no one's a storyteller if it's used that generally. And what they guaranteed don't mean by it is someone who has learned a lot of hopefully interesting stories by word of heart that they can tell by word of mouth. But that was my interest in it. It's not just the story, the narrative, but also the fact that it's going to be something that you're going to communicate to somebody else orally for their own retention and ability to retell it to someone else. In other words, that's how the stories live.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned in your book, and obviously here now, just the idea of the strain of oral storytelling's connection to culture, and that's how we passed things down. That's how culture was born out of, was oral storytelling, oral communication. You have a quote early on in your book that I wanted to use as a jumping off point to this, because it reminded me a lot of some of the writing of Joseph Campbell, and I was curious what your perspective on this was. We step into the future with less connection to ancestral guidance than any human generation before us. Although we have invented amazing technologies for saving data, we are at risk for forgetting our personal, family, and cultural stories. So first of all, could you go in a little more about what you feel it is that we have lost or are losing, and why are we losing it?
That's a long
it's a big question.
A long answer.
Yeah.
I mean, I can just say personally, I grew up in the 50s in Detroit, Michigan, in a suburb. I mean, how can I say this? It seems to me that there isn't a kind of a daily awareness of the. This sounds a little portentous or something, but the wisdom of the ancestors is just not so much part of everyday life. I grew up in, I'm the first TV generation, and now we're several computer generations in, and I just don't find it to be a listening culture. It's not a culture we grow up in where we're taught to listen, where we're taught. I always like that story about Hoja Nasruddin. He's kind of a wise fool. And they said, how did you achieve your wisdom? And he said, well, when I find that there's somebody who's wise, I go and listen to what they have to say. And if I find out people have been listening to me, I try to find out afterwards what I just said. Yeah. In other words, you kind of, until you have that listener, you don't really know what you have expressed. You don't know what they've made of it.
Yeah.
And I mean, in other words, that need to be interactive seems really important to me. And I think, I mean, I grew up in a culture, as has continued, where we're passive. We're passive. The culture's made elsewhere and sustained elsewhere. And this idea that you carry your own culture within yourself because you know your stories, I think that's kind of either a thing of the distant past or a thing of the coming future, but it doesn't seem to be a big part of the current moment.
Yeah. Well, that the emphasis on listening I find fascinating, because I haven't done nearly the research and just time spent with this as you have, but just I have, my intuition has told me recently that a huge part of storytelling is listening, not just on the part of the listener, but also on the part of the storyteller. And your book had a lot of great aspects on that. It's that aspect of listening. I almost feel like listening it's not seen conventionally as an act, but in many ways it is. Like it I've tried to say to people before, it sounds counterintuitive, but storytelling is more important that you listen to your audience even more to understand where they are and try to reach them in some way, not reverse engineer them or second guess them, but just kind of it's almost more important than what you say is how you listen, it seems. And I don't know if you agree with that at all, or if you. Sorry.
Well, I think that storytelling with you kind of co-create with the listener.
Yeah.
I mean, even if the story is told word for word, like you know it by heart, even so, though, as you're telling it, there's a sense that the audience is imagining with you. I mean, a story's a mind movie, right? Mm-hmm. So when you're telling the story, you're giving the words, but the audience is making up the movie. So yeah, it's essentially interactive. Mm-hmm. They're listening is a creative act. So as people listen to a story, supposed to anything else, but particularly to a story, because a story doesn't come with its own interpretation or operating manual. You know, you have to kind of find its meaning on your own. Without that listener's creativity, you don't really know what you've got.
Yeah.
I was just telling stories just before I came here. I was at a place called the Witchwood Open Doors, which feeds a lot of, I would say street people or people living kind of rough. And we had a little circle. They'd already had their lunch. It's a real busy place. So people come from all around the neighborhood and they come there for lunch, for free lunch. And it was wonderful just to have this gathering of people from Trinidad, Jamaica, Ecuador, Chile, Poland, Ghana, Africa. And, we're all sitting around. And even just because it was storytelling, I guess, it was instantly a community. In other words, they all, without me ever saying it out loud, I think the implicit sense was that these stories that we're sharing belong to everybody, that they're a collective creation. So, and I told a few folk tales. I mean, I told a story from Jamaica, and I told a story from Italy, and so I was telling them folk tales, and then we shared personal stories as well. But I guess that sense that storytelling is a communal art form. Yeah. There's no fourth wall. You don't have a performer-spectator relationship. Ultimately, if it's an oral story, there's an inner sense that the story migrates to the listener, that there's a movement to the listener who then is responsible to keep it alive.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So jumping back on that a little bit, you say you just came from telling some stories. How is it that you yourself got into this, where you're making a living telling oral stories?
Let's use the term "making a living" very flexibly.
Yes,
please. But it is what I've done all my adult life, and you're saying, how did I get into it, or what do I do now?
Yeah, well, I guess both. Like, what brought you into this realm?
Yeah, so I had fallen in love with literature, particularly oral. This idea of oral, the bards and the troubadours, Homer, and the medieval troubadours that go from castle to castle. So that world just seemed wonderfully romantic and interesting to me when I was young. And then I worked at a summer camp for really poor kids. And what I saw is that they listened to stories. They didn't listen to anything else, but they liked to listen to stories. So that gave me this thought, I better start to learn some stories, tell them at the campfire. And when that summer was over, I had good luck because I went to the library where I used to get the books of stories, folk tales from around the world that I would tell to the kids. So I went back to that library at the end of the summer, and I met some really remarkable old women. I often think that you want to be a storyteller, find the old women. That's okay. Right. And in this case, they were retired children's librarians, and they were really gifted storytellers. And they didn't seem to mind having this 20-something-year-old California hippie show up. I'd already moved to Canada, show up and follow them around, and they seemed to be happy, and so I was their kind of apprentice. So that's how I got started. Yeah. And what I do now for a so-called living, it's not really what I'd recommend to anybody as a living, but anyways, what I do, I'm a storyteller in residence at a place called Baycrest Center for Geriatric Care. So I go 3 times a week, and I tell stories with psychiatry patients. I tell in the palliative care ward. I tell in rehab. I'm, kind of been woven into the life of the hospital. And that's been a really fun gig. I've done it for 3 years, and funded through a bequest. A woman's mother died, and the woman's mother had loved creative writing. And so when she died, she took her inheritance or a part of it and put it towards this position. And I applied and got the job. So,
wow. I obviously had no idea that's what you were doing now. What reason do they have to bring a storyteller in residence?
So the position was created by a very really tuned in woman named Melissa Taffler, who's the coordinator of the Arts and Health program at Baycrest, which is a role she created for herself. And she brings in dancers, film, visual arts, and so on. But her real thing was to try to develop the role of literature, and particularly storytelling, in the hospital. And so we've been, there's an old proverb that says you make the path by walking it. Okay. Mm-hmm. So Spanish proverb. So that's what we've been doing. Honestly, when I started, I had no idea what it meant to be a storyteller in residence. But the very first clinical setting that I got invited into was psychiatry. So I've been there for really almost 3.5 years now on the psychiatry floor, and I work with inpatients and outpatients. We do everything from telling folk tales to doing creative writing to remixing stories to telling personal stories. It's really interesting. And so, I feel like it's kind of, my mandate isn't clinical. I'm not there as a therapist or even a narrative therapist or any of that stuff. I'm really there as an artist. But I feel like it's kind of enriched the life of the hospital by having storytelling there.
That's really interesting. Yeah, so they must be there. I guess are you learning some of the effects that it's a different audience than you've ever had in that respect, right? So what are some of the differences there? What are you learning from this experience?
Yeah, those are good questions. I want to spend the next year thinking about all of this, because I kind of got to go along and do stuff, but I haven't had a lot of time to reflect on what it is. Yeah. But for example, what day is today? Is Wednesday. On Monday, I was in the palliative care ward. So I visit with patients. Sometimes their family members are there. I find out about their lives. That's obviously legacy's a big part of this. But I also try to find stories that I think they would find very interesting. Sometimes I'll even tell a story, and I'll do the Scheherazade thing. I'll stop it halfway through. So in the Arabian Nights, she would always stop her story so the king wouldn't chop off her head. Right. So I'll stop the story. I'll say, well, I'll come back next Monday and tell you the rest.
That's amazing.
It's a little tricky in palliative care, but so far it's so good. Like they've no one's died on me yet. But,
right.
Not in the middle of a story. Many people I have told stories with have passed on since I started. Yeah. Which is a heavy thing, because you go in, you develop a relationship with somebody, and from one week to the next, maybe they've left.
Yeah. Pivoting from that back to just the power and the reason you've emphasized oral storytelling above others, or maybe not above, but your preferred way of telling these stories. Can you tell me a little bit more of obviously it's in your book, but for our listeners, why is why do you have such that feeling towards oral storytelling as compared to other methods of narrative?
Well, I don't know. I always liked this idea that somebody could go around Greece,
Yeah.
Homer would travel around from court to court, and his entire repertoire was in his head.
Yeah.
He had his lyre, played music. He knew the Iliad and the Odyssey in his head and was welcome wherever he went. And this idea of the old-time storyteller has always been really compelling to me. In native culture, indigenous culture, it's the elders.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I have friends, elders, who could tell you a story for a week.
Yeah.
No rush, right? Like a long, long story. In medieval Europe, it was the troubadours and the Minnesingers. And just this idea that people would go around and they kind of. My friend Ron Evans is a Métis storyteller, and he talks about storm fools.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To me, that's just a cool idea that the storm fool is the storyteller goes out in any blizzard, under any circumstances, to tell stories to people who are feeling very isolated. And to me, that's kind of what a modern storyteller has to do, is you have to go find an audience. That's what I was saying about telling in a healthcare setting. It's not performer spectator anymore. I've noticed in psychiatry, for example, when people are listening to a story, they're really listening deep. They're listening for news of their own possibilities. They have given up. They're being treated for severe depression. So they're listening to a story, and they're not just listening to be entertained. They're listening for dear life. Yeah. And the stakes couldn't be higher, right? So I feel like my responsibility as a storyteller in that setting is to give them something that, for example, makes them want to know what happens next.
Yeah.
In that context, if you're severely depressed, you don't care anymore what happens next. You've given up wondering what happens next. So a storyteller can go in and model the experience of suspense. Now, that it's more than that, because obviously the content of the story has to be interesting and rich and so on. But even that fundamental experience of listening and wanting to know what happens next in a context of being treated for clinical depression, that's an important new experience for them.
Yeah.
So
that's incredibly beautiful, because I've never thought of that connection. For a clinically depressed person, just the desire to want to know what's going to happen next can be huge.
You've lost that.
Yeah.
You've lost. You're no longer imagining.
Yeah.
That in your own life there's going to be a next.
Right.
So. Now, I didn't know any of this when I started there. This is all stuff I've picked up by being there. That even the other day, I was telling stories, and I was visiting on the palliative ward, and I came to a family, and the husband was very close to death, and I went into the room. I didn't want to disturb them because it was a solemn moment, but even so, I'd met him before. He was a very funny guy, and the family, you could tell it was very loving, but more than that, he was a humorous person, right? So just on the whim, just spur of the moment, I said to the wife, he couldn't talk anymore. He was very close to death, but I said to her, did he have a favorite joke? And she said, yeah. I said, could you tell it to me? So she did. So his favorite joke was that the Pope needed a heart transplant. And he came out on the balcony of the Vatican. He looked out over St. Peter's Square, and he said to the people there, my people, my faithful, your Pope, have been told by the doctor that without a new heart, I will die. So I would like to ask you, someone here, to donate your heart for me. Thousands of people called out, take my heart, take my heart, take my heart. I guess they had very bad Italian accents.
Right.
Heart. And the Pope was very moved by this. It was beautiful. And he said to them, thank you for your generosity. I going to look for a sign from God, so to know whose heart to take. So then all of a sudden, a white dove was flying over St. Peter's Square, and a feather flew right down from the wing of the dove. And the feather was floating down, floating down. And the Pope said, that is the sign from God that I was looking for. Whoever the feather lands on, that person will become the one who donates your heart for me. And the voices continued to shout, take my heart. But now they went. So funny enough, so she tells me this story, and I was wearing a down parka at the time. And out of a little part of the parka, I guess it was torn or something, a little white feather flew out over the bed.
Oh, man.
And she looked at it and said, well, he's having the last word.
That's right. That's fantastic.
Now, that family really, even in a moment of such extreme grief, they laughed. Yeah. And I think they felt good that their dad was he was being honored because they've become his story keepers. And that's one thing in palliative care we'll sometimes talk about, is that not just there, even let's say somebody's got Alzheimer's or they have dementia, then their loved ones become their story keepers. And that's another part of being a storyteller in healthcare, is to remind people, what does it mean to keep someone else's stories alive for them?
Wow. I mean, where do you go with that? What does it mean to keep someone's stories alive?
Well, I often think of that old proverb that says, a person is not dead unless they have been forgotten.
Yeah. And
so, again, in the context of healthcare, that's, and again, not just palliative, because I work a lot with people with Alzheimer's and dementia, and they cannot tell their own story very well anymore. So their loved ones become the keepers of their story.
Wow. Yeah. Wow, that's incredibly moving. This is fascinating, and yeah, I'd be fascinated to hear more as you continue to put it in perspective for yourself, in whatever way you do that. But that's incredible. Do you? It's funny. Even when you're telling me that joke just now, I feel this thing where I almost where I forget that we're here. I forget that we're on Skype. I forget anything else, and I'm imagining the story in my mind. That vulnerability that we have as listeners to a story where everything melts away almost without our telling it to. Sometimes even without our permission, we get taken to these places. How are you interested in some of the ways that we're trying to explore that today in science, or do you have in evolutionary research? Why do we feel that way, or do you have your own kind of way that you think about that? Why we have, and maybe what responsibilities come with the storyteller in wielding such power like that?
Well, let's put that in perspective. Wielding such power, but in reality, we're a very small art form. In a very crowded media landscape. So I don't know that we have very much power. I think one good thing about storytelling, though, is that is that when in an era when people are using stories to win elections, to sell product, and to be persuasive in any kind of number of ways, it could be that the actual old-time storyteller is there to remind you that stories are not meant to be manipulated and used for ads or cheapened by a certain kind of political rhetoric. And I thought of that recently when a certain leader who shall not be named used a beautiful metaphor. He said, "Drain the swamp." Right. That's a fantastic metaphor. The minute I heard it, I begrudged it, because I thought, that's a great, you're going to win, buddy. Right. Not that it's true. Right. It doesn't need to be. But that's to me, it's a pernicious use of the power of metaphor, but it's an effective one. Right. So it almost seems to me that in this era when we can communicate so many ways, and that this, how would I say it? That we kind of need to remember that storytelling as an art form and as a tradition could only be sustained when the stories have their own integrity, and they are not used to sell a pair of shoes or a political view. At that point, they start to lose what they are as stories. They just become I don't know what to call them, but they just other forms of manipulation in a society that's already completely under the spell of the ads and so I'm not saying it very articulately, but I guess there's an old Jewish proverb that says the more stories you know, the more ways you have of telling the truth.
Yeah.
Which I think is useful to remember nowadays, that when you go through life, you've got a head full of good stories, they do give you a critical frame. They give you a sense of perspective, and they give you the ability to imagine the lives of others. And, these are useful things nowadays.
Yeah. Yeah. That I'm reminded of Roger Ebert, the film critic, when he would refer to movies as empathy machines. And I always liked that description.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think of it, it's funny because it's I mean, do you have any kind of fail-safes, being a fellow human being, a fellow Homo sapien that's susceptible to this? Do you as a listener, how do you guard against being kind of taken in by the seductive story that may speak here but actually isn't real? Or do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Look, if you grow up with a lot of stories, you spend your life kind of immersed in story, you have a very, very very acute bullshit detector.
Yeah.
Right? Because you hear this, just like I said, I saw Trumpty Dumpty and it's all drain the swallow. Oh, okay. And I know that's not true.
Right.
But what a beautiful metaphor.
It's a beautiful one.
And when I couldn't think of one metaphor that Ms. Clinton had used in the campaign, I thought, sweetheart, metaphors win elections. Like, when will they? How come anyway, doesn't matter. We don't want to talk politics, but
yeah,
that's true. Metaphors win elections, and that one was a very effective one.
We just figured it out. It's storytelling. That's the difference. That's the difference right there.
It is a certain debased, cynical form. I'll tell you, there's a good example of that in the Canterbury Tales. If you read the Canterbury Tales by Chaucer, one of the pilgrims on the way to Canterbury is called the Pardoner, okay? Because he sells pardons. Like, in those days, you could buy indulgences and pardons. Didn't have to change a damn thing about your life, but if you could buy a pardon from somebody like him, the Pardoner. And he says to the pilgrims, he says, look, this is what I do. I con peasants. That's what I do. I'm a con artist. I tell them any kind of horseshit, and they believe it. I tell them this feather from a peacock fell from the wing of Angel Gabriel. And they all say, oh, we want to see the feather from the wing of Angel Gabriel. He said, it's not true. It's all horseshit. And he tells the pilgrims the truth about his scam. Yeah. Then he tells a story. It's a great story about the three men who laughed at death.
Yeah.
They saw death outside the inn. They're taking a dead body, and they say, what happened? Oh, that's death. Takes everybody. And that's because it was the plague, probably. And they say, oh, the hell with death. It's, what's death to us? And they go camping. And one of them goes into town to get wine. And he thinks, I'm going to get those two guys. And he has the wine poisoned. Well, as he's bringing the poisoned wine back, they have this idea, let's get rid of him. And have more, I think they find some gold or whatever it is. Anyway, so he comes back, they kill him, they drink the wine, they're all dead. And, this is the Pardoner's great pitch that he uses when he's trying to scam people. He tells this very impressive story and, and then he turns to the pilgrim. He said, by now he's totally drunk. And he says, you too, you want to, here's this knuckle bone from Saint so-and-so, you can kiss it if you want. And what's interesting, he's already told them he's scamming them.
Yeah.
But he's so drunk at that point, he doesn't know his ass from a hole in the ground. And that the leader of the pilgrims, Harry Bailey, who is the innkeeper who's kind of going along on the pilgrimage, he just says to the partner, he says, you know what? He says it very rudely, and I won't say it on this interview. He tells basically to go, go.
Yeah.
And I've often thought of that scene because that shows that not only has he broken the social contract with the other pilgrims, in other words, he's treating them as customers, instead of just fellow pilgrims. More importantly, he's violated the sacred law of storytelling, which is a story has its own integrity. You can't use it to pitch. You can't use it as an ad. You can't use it to get people to send you to political office, because then you're breaking something very deep that has allowed stories to be sustained all these centuries.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if that makes any sense, but this kind of...
Oh, it does.
Yeah.
There's so much to go off. I mean, it's funny you mentioned the pardoner telling the crowd that he's conning them. It's funny because that does relate to storytelling, is the way I think about it, where it's you gain a lot of power with your audience just by seemingly, at least, being transparent. It's almost like the audience going, well, he's not BSing me because he's telling me he's BSing me. Like it's he's not hiding it from me. There it is. And in some way you become more trustworthy just by saying it.
But nowadays, your point is even more relevant, because there's a whole second generation of storytelling based on telling life stories. Of course, true stories, whatever that means. The Moth and going back to Oprah and on. But there's all kinds of. I mean, in Toronto, where I live, there's at least 10 different scenes where you could go during the week, and people telling their own personal experiences, and so it's got to be true, got to be short. But this whole idea, well, the minute you tell in the first person, you are inviting a certain kind of plausibility.
Yeah.
Even if the story you tell is very stylized, you're using the first person. So, of course, people are predisposed to say, oh, yeah, it's probably happened just that way.
Yeah.
Well, we all know that there's no such thing as it happened just that way. There's always some degree of shaping. Even if it did happen pretty close to that way, what you put in, what you leave out.
Yeah.
So this first person storytelling movement, which I find really fascinating, brings its own set of questions. Like, it's even called true stories. Okay. True stories. So What's a true story?
Right.
Anyway, that's a whole other discussion.
It is, but it's a very relevant one. You're absolutely right. We seem to be, maybe in some ways good, in some ways bad, revisiting a lot of these very fundamental questions about truth and fiction and storytelling and narrative and what all these things mean. And it's ultimately, hopefully, a good thing. And part of why I'm trying to do this podcast and this show is just to try and foster one side of that conversation as much as we can. We'll be right back.
This podcast is produced by Story First Media, a video content production company focused on storytelling. Cultivate your audience with story, then convert them to customers. Let us know about your upcoming video project at www.storyfirstmedia.com.
If you're consuming this content, you're either listening to it as a podcast or you're viewing it as a video, because it exists in both forms. If you'd rather watch my guests and I talk over Skype video, you can find this and all subsequent episodes by subscribing to my YouTube channel. Or if you'd rather listen to the conversation, it's available for download wherever you get your podcasts. I really think these conversations are valuable and will only get better as we go on. And having earned your attention means the world to me. These aren't short conversations. So if you have any comments, questions, suggestions for guests or topics, books I should read, etc., please email me at thenatureofstory@gmail.com or get me on Twitter or Facebook at Michael Neelsen. That's Neelsen. All right, back to the interview. It's interesting. You bring up interesting points about, I guess, if we talk about the inherent integrity of story, and how it can be misused, I think you mentioned in your book that it's the responsibility of the host to make sure that these stories are not used incorrectly. How do you find that line for yourself? I mean, because you talk about doing stories for UNICEF, for example. Today, your work that you're doing storytelling in healthcare, the storytelling for the purpose ends of some organization or entity. How do you judge that line? Is it entirely a personal judge, or how do you do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because that's a question I'm thinking about a lot these days. Yeah. Because what happens to an art form when it goes into a setting, well, let's say a performing art, that you take it off stage.
Yeah.
And let's say you bring it into a very grassroots kind of setting, or a very community type of setting, or in this case, a healthcare setting. And again, I have no clinical mandate there. I'm not there. I'm the fool in the palace. Right. I'm there just to be an artist. Okay. But obviously, because it's taking place in a place where rehab is part of it, or a good death is a goal, or psychiatric psychological healing is part of the mandate there. Obviously, those concerns kind of are the context for my choices of story, or how we tell them, or what we do with the stories. So I don't really have an answer for that.
Yeah.
It's at this point, I would say the questions are more interesting than the answers.
Yes, they are.
And at what point does an art form start to be so I don't want to say functional is probably the wrong word, but at what point does an art form start to serve other purposes other than being, just good at that art form? When does dance start to become dance therapy? When does music start to become music therapy? I've often wondered that at Baker. Luckily, there's nobody there doing storytelling therapy. There are dance, music, visual arts. There's the recreational therapists are there, of course, but somehow the storytelling's managed to kind of stay in its own little corner, and I can still go in as wearing the artist hat, and no one expects me to be doing anything that's going to have to be accounted for in a therapeutic framework.
Yeah.
Even though all the clinical staff I work with say, "Oh, that's having a strong." It's having a strong benefit for the people. Right. The psychiatry patients all say how much they like it. The people who are dying tell me how meaningful it is that they have storytelling as part of that. So, this is an interesting question. I don't have a good answer to it yet. There is one thing to say about that, though, is there is a movement now around the world of storytellers moving into healthcare.
Oh, okay.
And trying to figure it out. And there's there's a group called Healing Story Alliance that's based out of the National Storytelling Network in the States. Oh. And I'm a member of that. And you're on a listserv, and people will post questions sometimes. And you get other storytellers around North America saying, "Yeah, this is how it works for me." And but they're all working in some degree with healthcare.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I feel like there's I agree with you that the questions are almost more interesting than the answers at the moment. But there's like I feel it's almost we're almost in our efforts to try to understand, I guess for lack of a better way to phrase it, the ethics of storytelling, the morals of storytelling, whatever, the way to maintain storytelling's inherent integrity is almost like a ship passing another ship that's happening right now, which is the teaching morality to like artificial intelligence and like machine learning and like all these things. We're almost having to think about the way that because people are doing this research, like some of the, I'm sure you know this, a huge sum of money was spent in the last 15 years by the Department of Defense to study the neuroscience of storytelling and narrative, and so there's interests involved to learn how story affects brains and how to leverage it in a certain way, both in business and in government and in other ways. Okay. And we're almost in a position now where we're having to like figure out, okay, so now that entities have this power, now that we're figuring out they're going to be pulling this stuff, how do we judge what's good and what's bad with that? We almost are put in a position where we have to define what is story's inherent integrity in some way. And I find your thoughts on it fascinating. So I agree. I don't have an answer either, but just hearing your thoughts has been interesting.
Yeah. You remind me of the student who went to the rabbi and he said, "Rabbi, what's the meaning of life?" You probably know the story. And the rabbi slapped us. He said, "Why'd you slap me, teacher?" He says, "Well, how dare you give up such a good question for a mere answer?"
Right.
He said, "Answers divide us, but the questions we share bring us together."
Yes.
Which I often think of that. But you know what? I don't see this world that we're living in now, the digitized world, say, it's very hard for me to imagine a computer telling a good story. And the reason is it's at some very profound level not interactive. The computer might have an algorithm that can interpret my facial response and my heartbeat, but it's really not. It's not going to speak to my soul.
Right.
It can't. I've maybe that's the ultimate barrier, or the ultimate limitation on what can be designed for artificial intelligence. That I don't think they can build a computer that can tell a good story.
That's interesting. I've never heard that.
It could mimic. It could repeat. It could patch together elements of narrative. It could measure, this was an exciting thing that lots of people got, their heartbeat went out, their eyes widened. They could find all kind of metrics around story listening, responsiveness, etc. But I don't think the computer would ever know why it's a good story. Why does that story matter? Why would that story change someone's life? Because that's the thing that cannot be met. You can't measure meaning.
Yeah.
And science can measure everything but meaning.
Yeah.
That's the one thing it can't measure.
Yeah.
And art is very good at creating meaning, but it doesn't do it with metrics. It does it through life,
Yeah.
And not only that, half the time you don't even know your life has been changed by a story. 6 months later, you wake up and say, "Oh, that's what it's all,"
Yeah. Completely. Yeah. Or
Just the questions, though.
It's fascinating. I agree with you. Like you'll wake up, 6 years, 10 years down the road, and you'll somehow connect. You'll map some story thought you have into your mind onto your current existence and go, okay, I see how this works. I see the road ahead. I see how this.
That's a good. That in itself is a good metaphor, by the way. The map.
Yeah.
If you ever have a chance, read a book called "The Dreamer Awakes."
Oh, okay.
By Alice Kane, Kane. She was a fantastic Canadian storyteller, Irish-born. And the preface to the book is by Robert Bringhurst, who is a phenomenal poet who lives in Canada. And in the prologue to her book of fairy tales, or wonder tales, I guess you'd say, he writes about how stories are maps between worlds. And it's just a fantastic description of the power of story. He lives up on the West Coast on an island called Quadra Island. He's a wonderful poet and scholar, but he talks about how stories that's what they do in a society. They map the trail from home to wilderness. They map the trail from dream to everyday life, from death to routine existence.
Yeah.
From love to sorrow, and they give you maps for all of those journeys. So it's really good. I'd recommend that.
I'm going to take you up on that because that is really, I love that sort of stuff. I'm a big Joseph Campbell fan, and he speaks similarly about that, as you know. And just the both the pedagogical purpose of story and the way that it brings us into connection with what it is to be alive. They're like little vessels, little units. And I think that's
Let me jump in because there was one thing I thought of, but I forgot to mention it.
Yeah.
When you're talking about the connection to science, okay, I think there is one really interesting area of common ground that storytellers and scientists should be thinking about more, and that is the nature of listening. Mm-hmm. Because good science can very readily be framed as good listening. You're listening to a river. You want to find out why is it so polluted? Well, you're listening upstream. Yeah. Okay. You're listening to how the body works. You're listening to how the galaxies turn. The scientist as listener can be a very compelling way of understanding science. Good listening.
Yeah.
And that's where we really have a lot in common, because, of course, with storytelling, building a culture of listening is essential to sustaining the art of storytelling. So I've often thought that if a new myth was ever to grow or to develop in our society, a new big story, and speak of Joseph Campbell, the hero of that story would have to do with listening.
Mm-hmm.
It would be how to listen to yourself, how to listen to others, how to listen beyond cultural barriers, how to listen to your enemy, how to listen to your dreams, how to listen to the earth. But that one thread can connect science and culture in that way. And I think storytellers are really well positioned to kind of remind our fellow citizens that listening is what's the only thing that's going to save us at this point anyway.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Because I do feel there's, as you articulated earlier, just kind of a deficiency in listening in culturally nowadays. I'm reminded of kind of what I learned not too long ago was one of the impetuses for the Brothers Grimm to compile their stories of German folklore was that there were all these factions in Germany and they were trying to unite around a common history and a common shared, cultural stories. That idea of bringing people together through story, perhaps everything from the most extreme version where you're bringing together friend and foe, all the way to much easier down the spectrum. Why do you feel? And I guess I don't know where this would take you, but why do you feel stories have that power to bring us together, to bridge divide, to in some way give us a shared language? What is that?
I mean, for all the things you've just answered for yourself, it becomes
I'm doing it again.
No, it's a common tongue. I mean, the language of story is our second language, right? Yeah. It's the second language common to every human being is the language of story.
Yeah.
Beyond English, French, Croatian, and Cree, every human being is able to speak the language of story. And and you see it all the time, right? So the minute you hear someone else's story, you're no longer a complete stranger. You started to build a bridge. Yeah, it's interesting.
Well, and you're not, and as you mentioned, you feel stories are a collective kind of property. We all own these stories, and these stories are for everyone.
Yeah.
But there's also a everything from a tribal standpoint of German folklore, and this is our history, but all the way down to families. You talk a lot about just the family stories being important, and that the stories inherent to my family may carry some extra resonance for me because of my proximity to it. It's interesting to me to think about where we are today if we're losing our ability to listen to each other in some similar ways, and we're identifying more and more with our various tribes, be they familial, be they cultural, how to bridge that. And I feel like story is some key. I feel like it is somewhere there. It's like, as you said, the thing that's going to save us all in the end anyway. I don't know how to do it though. The question.
Yeah. But it cuts with two sides, right? Because you mentioned the German stories. Hitler loved Grimm, right? To him it was evidence of the Volksdeutsch, and for years after the war, they were compromised by his use of them.
Yeah, right.
Promulgate German culture. So, stories are, I don't know how to say it. They can unify, and they can divide. They can affirm cultural identity in a good way, or they can be used to condemn the infidel. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting question. It's stories in and of themselves are not the be all and end all. I guess it's how they're told and what they mean, and each story's different. You kind of wish I could go and say, yay, stories. But in fact, stories can be used to crush others.
Yeah, totally.
It's really the nature of each story that has to be looked at.
Yeah. Have you ever felt, this is maybe an interesting angle on it, have you ever felt in your years telling stories that you stepped on maybe the precipice of where, okay, I can sense right there, that's, if I went there, I'm betraying the integrity of story, and I can feel it now because I'm close to it. Like, have you ever gotten close to that fire before and sensed it for yourself, or have you always felt pretty secure in how you're using story?
Where that issue has become kind of interesting and thought provoking for me is I have a lot of Native friends who are storytellers, and this is a big question in Canada. I don't know in the States so much, but does a non-Indigenous person have a right to tell a story from a First Nations culture?
Yes, yeah.
And I mean, I kind of decided very early on that I didn't.
Yeah.
Although I spent a lot of time listening to the stories from Native tellers, and I love them, I don't feel they're mine to tell. So I never really felt this urge to kind of make them part of my own repertoire.
Sure.
So I'm kind of answering that indirectly, because I do think that's a pretty heated issue up here. I guess you're talking about standing at the precipice. That particular precipice I've avoided because I just decided no. And you know what? It's part of the nature of oral tradition. That stories, and I've noticed this a lot. Let's say in Indigenous culture, if there's an elder in the room who knows the stories better, no one's going to stand up to tell it.
Right.
They defer always to the one who knows the stories best. And that's partly a proprietary thing, and partly a matter of just respect, but partly it's the nature of oral tradition that you always want to give the voice to the one who knows the stories most authoritatively. So that's when you come to the other side of the precipice of using stories inappropriately. I mean, I feel like my role has been more kind of a critic of that.
Yeah.
That is, we had a mayor here in Toronto. He's a bit of a clown. He's no longer alive. He died young. But while he was here, he did a fair bit of damage. But he also won on a metaphor. So I wrote an article about him and why that particular metaphor was a misuse of story. So I kind of feel like we're in a position we can notice how stories are used manipulatively and try to voice alternatives to that. But I don't know. I'm trying to connect to what you said concretely.
No.
Have I ever felt like I violated some wrong? No, I've been pretty. I grew up. See, I'm a hero worshiper. Okay? But when I've met the storytellers I really admire in life, I follow them. I just love them. I kind of adore them, and do everything I can to listen to them and try to learn what they're trying to teach me. And what every single one of them has taught me is respect.
Yeah.
For stories, and for the power of stories. So.
Yeah.
Well, that's where I'm at now. Now that I'm this, I realized the other day with a shock that I am the same age as the woman who, to me, was my great mentor, Alice Kane. Oh. She was the woman who I met right after summer camp, right after I went to Alice. She was a retired children's librarian. She was exactly my age. To me, she was ancient. Right. Okay. I was a 22-year-old hippie from California, had moved to Canada. Alice was this retired children's librarian, and to me just seemed she was wise, not just for me but for a whole generation of Canadian storytellers. She was a great artist. She seemed ancient to me at the time. She was in her late 60s, and now I'm in my 60s. Okay. And I'm looking for that 25-year-old, maybe it's, I don't know how old you are, but that younger teller who comes and says, now I would like to be your apprentice. I want to learn. I want to. So for example, in a few weeks, I've got all the younger tellers of Toronto, the ones I really admire a lot, are coming to my house. And you know what a potlatch is?
Yeah, I assume like a potluck, or is it?
No, a potlatch is a giveaway feast.
Oh.
It's a native from the west coast of Canada. It's a giveaway ceremony. It's where a potlatch, which was banned by the missionaries and by the government for a long, long time. It was a criminal offense to observe a potlatch.
Wow.
To do the traditional giveaway. And I'm giving away my folktale library.
Wow.
And these are books I've saved since I was, young and interested in storytelling. And I just decided that I don't want to die with them on my shelf.
Wow.
I would rather send them back out into the world. So they're all coming. There are about 10 young tellers. And, as Alice helped me kind of decide to be a storyteller, I want to play that role for this new generation.
Wow.
So, and my rule in the giveaway is it's got to hurt. I'm not give away books that I think, I don't need that anymore. I'm going to give away the books that I most love.
Oh, man.
That's my criterion. But what's the point? I mean, when I'm gone, I don't want to just sit here collecting dust. I'd rather they're out there in the world. So, yeah, there's a big decision, but it kind of came to me. I thought, yeah, that's what storytellers should do. And anyway, a story is meant to be passed on.
Yeah.
That's the nature of a story. So even if the story's in book form.
Yeah, wow. That's incredible. There's so many places to go from that, but that's incredible for me to think about. That was to choose the books off your shelf, or me thinking for myself or my shelf. That would be so hard.
Yeah. I'm going to show you.
Oh man. Man.
Yeah, I'm sure. Those are going.
So which one's going to hurt? Looking right now, which one of those is going to hurt really bad?
Every single one of them.
Oh man.
Like giving away your kids. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway.
That's rough. Oh man, but that's incredible though. I agree with you. The passing down aspect of it, being as you say, if the tradition of oral storytellers is that's how you're passing down knowledge through the generations. This makes perfect sense.
If you lived in Toronto, you'd come on June 24th to my house, and you'd be very welcome to.
Yeah, that would be incredible. That'd be when I am in Toronto, I'm definitely going to call you up because I would love to meet you in person. But yeah, I guess I'm curious to follow up on one aspect of what you're talking about earlier with kind of the do you have the right to tell stories from another culture? I wonder, because I agree, I think about that a lot as well. Actually, we do have some aspects of that here in the States as well. And I think about it and I say I try and find, because there is that half of me that's analytical, in addition to being story. I try to find where is that. Because I believe also very much that when you receive a story as a listener, you internalize it in your own brain. Perhaps it molds slightly because of your listening, and it now becomes kind of part of you in some way. If we even poetically refer to it becoming your story as much as it is the teller's sort of thing. Yeah. There's like it's trying to balance those things because they're contradictory. Like it's how do you, and that's a real challenge. I don't know. Don't even know if there's a question there, but it's just kind of, it's tough.
Yeah, but the other thing to say though, and I think this is really relevant for someone like me who's kind of an invented storyteller. Like I didn't come out of an oral tradition at all.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I could say I grew up hearing Holocaust stories. My mother's a survivor. I grew up with children's literature and so, but I didn't. It was a new thing to be a storyteller for me, and with many people my generation, and trying to develop this whole movement. But it's just at the beginning, because this has only been going on like 30, 40 years, which is nothing in terms of a cultural change. So I often feel, and I take some comfort in this, that we're just reinventing the form as we go. There's a really beautiful Celtic proverb that says, every force evolves a form. Okay, every force evolves a form. So there's some kind of force in the world right now that says time to learn stories, to tell them orally, to listen, to gather, to remember, to reinvent, to remix, et cetera, et cetera. So we're all around the world. There's something going on. We're feeling the force of that. But the form is all to be discovered. Really, nobody knows what repertoire is most relevant. Nobody can really tell you this is a good way or a bad way to tell, or this is the right audience or not. All of those things are up in the air to be discovered. So I find that kind of exhilarating. That means that every person involved is a pioneer right now. There really are no answers, only questions.
You've been listening to The Nature of Story. I'm Michael Neelsen. This podcast was produced by Story First Media, a video content production company focused on storytelling. Our editor is Ryan Smith. Original music composed by Alexander Valdez.
Until next time, I'm Michael Neelsen.